If you watch Hollywood movies, then you know this guy and his famous line,
"Enough is enough! I have had it with these motherfucking snakes on this motherfucking plane!"
That was Samuel L. Jackson, and the movie was Snakes on a Plane. It's an iconic movie, but a little unrealistic. I mean, there's no way a lethal creature would make its way past airport security and end up on a plane, right? Right? Wrong. This is exactly what happened in 1955 on a flight going from Paris to New York. Instead of snakes, a German passenger carried a wooden box full of bees onto the plane. Yes, you heard it right. A box full of bees. And during the flight, he even threatened to let them loose. So what was he doing with bees on a plane? And what does this have to do with the Nobel Prize? Hi, my name's Pranav, you're watching Science is Dope, and this is the weird link between bees, clocks, and the Nobel Prize. Our story begins in 1906, far from the world of airplanes to a quiet summer home in Switzerland. Auguste Forel, a naturalist, is having breakfast with his family.
A lovely day, and what a lovely breakfast. Nothing could possibly ruin this. Wait, what's this? These damn bees, where are they coming from? Shoo, get away, shoo! Come, let's all finish breakfast inside.
The next day, Forel sits down with his family for breakfast. Within no time, the bees are back, their hungry eyes set on the honey. This happens again and again, and the uninvited guests keep increasing in number. They are clearly smelling the food. Defeated by the bees, Forel decides to have breakfast indoors from the next day. Closing all doors and windows, they sit down for their meal. But what's this sound? It's coming from the terrace.
Impossible. The bees are back again. But how? They cannot smell the food. The doors and windows are locked.
Forel hypothesized that it was the bees that could figure out when the breakfast would be available. He claimed that the bees have an internal clock that helped them perceive time. He called this time memory. But if you know how science works, the story doesn't end there. Science works like this. You have an initial observation and you try to make an intelligent guess about what led to that observation. That's something called a hypothesis. In this case, the initial observation was the observed bee behavior, and the hypothesis was that bees have an internal clock. For a lot of scientists, this hypothesis was a bit far-fetched. After all, bees are small creatures with an extremely tiny brain. You wouldn't expect such complex thoughts like perceiving time from such simple creatures. Okay, fine. I'm sorry. Okay, don't start crying now. There were many other reasons to be skeptical. What if they did not have time memory and instead were just perceiving external stimuli? For example, Forel had a very regular breakfast time at the same spot every day. Many factors such as temperature, humidity, amount of sunlight, they're cyclical and they tend to repeat over the course of a day. The weather conditions at 9 a.m. today will likely be similar to the weather conditions at 9 a.m. tomorrow. So the bees may have been correlating these factors to the presence of food on the table. That was their alternate hypothesis. So we have two hypotheses for the same observation, and obviously they can't both be right? One has to be wrong. So how do we resolve this? How do we figure out which one is more valid? We need to test the hypotheses, and that is the next step in the scientific method. Perform experiments and make observations that help you verify or falsify your hypothesis. And 20 years after Forel, the German biologist Ingeborg Belling did just that. Her experiments proceeded in two phases. First phase, she kept a sugar dish near the beehive at a particular time every day, say 8 am to 9 am, and the bees reacted to the stimuli and came to feed. She kept doing this for many days with the location of the dish and the time of feeding being kept constant over all those days, and at all other times, the dish was removed. And just like Forel had observed, the bees came every day between 8 am and 9 am in anticipation of the food. Then she proceeded with the second phase of the experiment. And what was that second phase? She removed the dish completely at all times. She wanted to check when the bees would return. Now this sounds an awful lot like Forel's experiments, right? Yes, it's exactly the same except for one key difference. Belling performed her experiments in a closed and controlled box. And inside this box, she kept the temperature and amount of light constant throughout the day. So basically, the external stimuli didn't change over time. Depending on the observations of the experiment, she would know which hypothesis makes most sense. If the bees did not return, that would mean external stimuli played a part and Forel's hypothesis would fail. And if they did, then Forel's hypothesis would be verified. And what did she observe? The bees returned even when the dish wasn't there, and exactly between 8 am and 9 am. This was a groundbreaking observation, and it falsified the alternate hypothesis that scientists had. Forel's hypothesis may indeed be the right one, but we can only be sure about this after further testing, and that's where we come to the scene at the beginning of the video. You would think that this is the end of the story, but no, scientists don't give up their skepticism so easily, especially when the hypothesis is as strange as bees can perceive time. What if the bees were making conclusions based on not terrestrial weather conditions but rather celestial cues? Something like the gravitational pull of the moon, or maybe unaccounted solar radiation that we couldn't see but were actually penetrating the walls of that enclosure. Belling's experiment had accounted for terrestrial stimuli, but how could she account for solar radiation? And this was the alternate hypothesis. And how do we resolve it? Again, by testing further, by performing more experiments. Which brings us to the scene at the start of our story. A German passenger with a box full of bees on a plane. Max Renner was a German biologist who was interested in this time memory of bees. He had closely followed Forel and Belling's work and wanted to find the answers to the questions surrounding them. And this is how he found himself on a plane from Paris to New York.
Good evening, sir. Why don't you lock that box in the upper compartment? You'll be able to sit more comfortably.
Well, I'm pretty sure I'd be comfortable, but I don't know about them.
Who's they?
The bees.
What bees?
The bees inside the box.
You mean there are bees in that box right there?
Yes, I'm flying them to New York with me.
You're kidding, right? Bees aren't allowed on this flight, sir. So you need to take your bees and get off this plane.
I can't do that. My experiment depends on it. If you don't allow me to take them, I'm gonna let them loose in this plane.
Okay, no, we don't want that. Why don't you keep your bees? I don't get paid enough for this.
Why was he carrying bees to New York? And what was this experiment? Let's find out. Max Renner's experiment was similar to Belling's. Just like Belling, the first phase was to train the bees to feed at a particular time in a closed box. He did this in Paris from 8:15 to 10:15 am French time. And for the second phase, he flew the bees all the way to New York. And from there, he removed that feeding dish and observed when the bees came to feed. And what was the reason for this kind of an experiment? If the bees were indeed measuring solar radiation, then they would come out to feed at the same time when these factors were similar to 8:15 to 10:15 in Paris. However, if they had an internal clock, then they would come out exactly 24 hours later. And since New York is 6 hours behind Paris, this would be 2:15 to 4:15 in New York. In other words, the bees would be jet lagged, and this is what Max Renner wanted to observe. And if the bees were not jet lagged, then Forel's hypothesis would be wrong. And if they were jet lagged, then that's another point in favor of Forel's hypothesis. And what did he observe? Drum roll. The bees came between 2:15 and 4:15 in New York. They were indeed jet lagged. And Renner repeated this experiment when he flew back to Paris, but the results were the same. This observation was convincing enough evidence that bees had an internal clock. After these experiments, interest grew in this field of research called chronobiology. Scientists found evidence of more such creatures, including humans, that have an internal clock, and they call this the circadian rhythm. It's what helps you wake up at the same time every day, even when you forget to keep an alarm. It's what makes you feel hungry at the same time every day. It's what makes you feel like using the restroom at the same time every day. But what causes this circadian rhythm? This question eluded scientists for a long time, but soon that was also going to change. In the early 1970s, scientists from Caltech experimented on fruit flies and figured out that there's a gene which they call the period gene which controlled this circadian rhythm. It produced a protein called the period protein which cycled once every 24 hours. But we still didn't know what caused this problem until Michael Rosbash, Jeffrey Hall and Michael Young got their hands on this problem. They thought, what if the period gene itself was self-switching? What if the period protein was causing the gene itself to shut off? This is called a negative feedback loop, and you see this everywhere in nature. For example, take this pendulum. The higher it rises on one side, the more it wants to come back to the center. But Rosbash and team thought that the same thing applied to the period gene. When switched on, it produced the period protein and caused its concentrations to rise. But this caused the period gene itself to shut off. And when shut off, no more period protein was created, causing its concentrations to drop again. Because of this, the gene was switched back on again. And this cycle repeats. For a more detailed explanation, you can check out this video right here. I'll leave a link in the description. Rosbash and team conducted extensive experiments and verified their hypothesis in 1991. And with that, the final piece of this puzzle called the circadian rhythm was put in place. And for their contributions, Rosbash, Hall and Young received the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2017. There are two reasons why I like the story. One, it's a great example for the scientific method in action. Often in schools, we only learn the results of science and not how it's done. We often learn only those final theories that succeeded and not all the multiple hypotheses that came before and were tested and falsified. In this video, we've done just that. We discussed hypotheses like the external stimuli hypothesis and the solar radiation idea and how they were tested and rejected before we finally arrived at the gene responsible for circadian rhythm. And in this process of eliminating bad ideas, we gained a lot of insight that led us towards the right one. This is how science works. This is the scientific method in action. 2. How a simple observation gave birth to an entire field of science. If you remember, we started the story with Forel and his surprise at how the bees kept coming to his balcony even when there was no food. And we ended up with Rosbash and team that figured out the genetic reasons behind circadian rhythm. Within a few decades, we learned so much that we created an entire field of science called chronobiology. All because scientists kept persisting more and more to understand the world around us. Videos like these are expensive to make. If you like watching it, I'd really appreciate if you support me on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee or YouTube memberships. If you like this video, you might like this one where I've talked about the birth of the telescope and its evolution into the massive space telescopes of today. I'll see you in the next one. Till then, remember, science is dope.